Okay, and we are on part 2 of our Shir series on the superiority of rabbinic laws over Torah laws. We're going to do a brief recap, but don't let the fact that it's a recap prevent you from asking questions on the recap material, okay? Because last time we went over the facts and the kind of like the premises and the setup, and if there's something missing in the facts, then it's going to affect like the actual ideas. So don't hesitate to ask. And we're as far as I'm concerned, we're not in a rush. I naively thought that this would be like a 1 or 2 session shir, but might be more than that. Okay, so the question on the table is that I was asked was, what is the impetus for one to follow halachos d'Rabbanan when I'm sitting alone at night in the privacy of my home? What should motivate me to not eat chicken with cheese? And then we broaden that with Esti's reformulation of the question, or not reformulation, her formulation, which is how are we supposed to relate to these different levels of halacha? Okay, and I like that better because I was discussing this initial question with one of my chavrusas, and I said this is a question that was sent to me, and he said I should ask that person what's the impetus for in his mind for following halachos d'oraisa, like following halachos from the Torah, and that made me realize it's a good question. Made me realize though that we could take this in a much deeper way, but I think Esti's question like localizes it to what I intended the shir to be initially, which is how do we relate to d'Rabbanans? Okay, so let's I guess we'll frame it in terms of that. Okay, so and also Maya asked the question of basically how did halacha get to the point where it is now in terms of such detail. I grayed the question out because when she asked it, I wasn't sure if we were going to take that up in this year, and I've decided to not take it up in this year, even if it is we could take it up in the future. It's a good question, but just didn't want to like set up the expectations.
Can I expand my question for 1 minute?
Yes, please do.
Okay, so how would you say that we relate to Doraisas that this would be in contrast to?
Okay, so how would we contrast this with the way we're supposed to relate to Deoraisa? Yeah, okay, good. Lost. Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, that we will start to get into today. Because we'll begin the answer, I hope. Okay, so the game plan from last time was go over the facts, which we did, and then go over the question, which we're going to review. And then today we're going to begin the Ron's answer. There's really 4 parts to the Ron's answer, and I anticipate getting to the first part today. And the first part is the biggest part, like idea. First part might be the biggest idea. It's certainly bigger than the next 2 parts, but we'll see. Okay, so review of last time. Okay, we did the Rambam's view, which is for all intents and purposes in line with the Ran, who's the main Rishon we're going to be focusing on. Both of them hold that what gives the rabbis authority is 2 psukim in the Torah, or that's what the Rambam quotes here. Al piha Torah asher yorucha ve'al mishpat asher yomer lecha taseh. According to the Torah that they instruct you, and according to the judgment they say to you, you shall act. And that is a mitzvah saseh. We are obligated by God to obey these rabbis, and we'll clarify what these rabbis are in a second. And then the second thing is a lo saseh, lo sasur mikol hadavar asher yagidu lecha yamin usmol. Do not deviate from anything that they tell you, left or right. And that is a lo saseh, that is a Torah prohibition. And according to the Rambam, that is what instills all of the laws of the rabbis with authority. And in fact, hold on, I saw this, I was giving a parallel shir on this different topic in my Rambam B'kiyus shir, and there was this great turn of a phrase that I wanted to read. This is a book called Moses Maimonides' Life and Thought by Moses Halbertal. And he uses this great phrase. If I can't find it, then I'll skip it. Hold on. He says, wait for it, that according to the Rambam, sorry. Yeah, according to the Rambam, oh man, I can't find it. I should have pinned it ahead of time. Okay, never mind. False alarm. All right. Maybe I'll send it later. Okay, so that's why we have to follow the rabbis, and rabbis here are rabbis with a capital R, as I call it, which is the Sanhedrin in Yerushalayim, the Supreme Court. And then someone sent me a question afterwards, a clarification question, that what's the difference between Chazal and Sanhedrin in the way that I use this term? So Chazal means the sages who are quoted in the Mishnah and in the Gemara. Okay, and in the other Tannaitic and Amoraic works like the the Sifra, the Sifrei, the written down versions of Torah Sheba'al Peh up until the sealing of the Talmud in around the year 500. So those are Chazal, and many of those members of Chazal were, at least the ones whose names we know, were on the Sanhedrin. But the analogy I would give here, just to clarify the terms, is like we speak of the Supreme Court of the United States, and then we speak of excellent judges. Okay, so like the Supreme Court of the United States had lots of excellent judges on it, but not all excellent judges were on the Supreme Court. And then when you refer to the two terms, when you say excellent judges, that's referring to the individual people. But when you say Supreme Court, you're talking about like a legal entity. So when I say Sanhedrin, I'm referring to the legal entity, but I will often use it interchangeably with Chazal because for all intents and purposes, the rabbis who were on the Sanhedrin were members of this larger group called Chazal. So that was just a factual clarification there. Okay, so they have the authority to make these laws. And the Rambam says that there are three categories of laws. Let me back up. They have authority over three realms of law. The three realms are Torah Sheba'al Peh. Okay, we'll redefine these in a second. Laws derived from the hermeneutic principles that the Torah is expounded through, midos she'atorah nidreshes behen, and then what we call, broadly speaking, halachos d'Rabbanan. Okay, so Torah Sheba'al Peh is when they elucidate the mitzvos in the written Torah based on the oral explanation given to Moshe at Sinai. So that's, when the Torah says, don't cook a kid in its mother's milk, then if you just had the Torah Shebechsav, the written Torah, you would think that means specifically a baby goat, specifically in its mother's milk. But we have an oral tradition, unanimous, going all the way back to Moshe, that it means any domesticated animal in any milk from a domesticated animal, not just a goat and not just its mother, and not just its mother's milk. And that is something that Chazal were the custodians of. Okay, and they passed that down, and we are beholden to them in terms of their authority on that. Okay. Second example is laws derived from the principles that the Torah is expounded through. So that's like Kal V'chomer, Gezerah Shava, Binyan Av, Klal Uprat, these rules of expounding. And I want to introduce a new point that is from that book that I was quoting, Moses Halbertal, that illustrates the difference between Torah Sheba'al Peh and midos she'atorah nidreshes behen. Okay, this is a new point, all right? And this is according to the Rambam. So Moses Halbertal gives this analogy. Let's say you had a law that was created by your city that says vehicles are not allowed in a public park. Okay, so that is the law, and it's indisputably that's the law. No one questions that that's the law. Okay, but then let's say you have there are two ways to expound on that law. Okay, one mode of expounding is let's call it elucidation. Okay, that would be asking the question, when the law says vehicle, what is included in vehicle? Okay, is it just cars? Is it cars and motorbikes? What about scooters? That type of activity of like legal interpretive activity is trying to get at what was the intent, not what was the intent, what was the meaning of that term in the law. When it said vehicle, they're trying to clarify these terms. Okay, but then there's a completely different activity, which is, let's say you take that law and you say, well, if vehicles are prohibited to be in a public park, so Kal V'chomer, it should be illegal for vehicles to drive into a schoolyard. Okay, now that's a different kind of interpretation, because no one is claiming that schoolyards are public parks. Okay, they're not. Schoolyards belong to the school. They have different functions, but it is a deduction based on the original law. Okay, and what the Rambam holds is that Chazal really were involved in both types of interpretations of psukim. Okay, on the one hand, they were entrusted with the interpretations handed down to Moshe at Sinai that clarified the terms in Torah Shebechsav. So when it says in Sukkos dwell for 7 days, what do we mean by Sukkos? That's interpretive activity. But then on the other hand, they were given the right to deduce new laws through the midos she'atorah nidreshes behen, and that's saying, the Torah prohibits this, But since the Torah prohibits that, can we make a new law using these methods that expands the Torah's prohibition rabbinically to include other cases? Okay, and those are two different kinds of activities. In the first case, all of these interpretations are unanimous. No one ever questions that pre-eitz hadar is referring to an esrog. No one ever questions that ayin tachas ayin, an eye for an eye, is referring to monetary compensation as opposed to poking out eyes. Okay, however, if their chazal are deducing new laws and making new rabbinic laws built upon the deoraisas through rabbinic enactments, but they're using the pesukim as support, there it's subject to dispute. And this analogy carries over to that also. Okay, let's say I'm one judge and I say, well, if vehicles are prohibited in the public park, then they should also be prohibited in a schoolyard because of a kal v'chomer. Okay, why? Because if we're concerned about safety in public parks, that there might be like kids running around. Well, there are even more kids running around in schoolyards. So we should make an extension to that law that prohibits vehicles in schoolyards. But then let's say you're another judge and you say, no. Parks are not places where cars should even be, but in schoolyards, you need parents to pick up and drop off kids. So you can't make a kal v'chomer. The cases are not analogous. So this is where you would have Chazal arguing about how to extend the Torah's laws through rabbinic enactments. And you can have machlokas on that. And that's when the Sanhedrin would vote about whether to make this new law or not. So it can look to the untrained eye, it can look like Chazal are doing the same thing because they both quote psukim, but in category A, Chazal are merely the custodians of unanimously accepted traditions handed down going all the way back to Moshe at Sinai. Whereas in case B, Chazal are using their legalistic authority given to them by the Torah to create new laws that they use the psukim for support for through these hermeneutic principles.
Is one d'oraisa and one d'Rabbanan, or they're both?
According to the Rambam, one is d'oraisa and one is d'Rabbanan. According to the Rambam, then okay, I'm going to say this even though this is like a 1-minute summary of something that I was focusing on all week in Rambam shir. Very, very complicated. But when you see the Gemara take a pasuk and give a drasha, okay, like use one of these interpretations. So the Rambam's rule is that if Chazal say explicitly that it's deoraisa, then that means it's in category A. But if they don't say it's deoraisa, then you assume it's derabbanan. Okay, that's the Rambam's rule. That they have to say if they're giving drashos, if they're giving these hermeneutic interpretations of psukim, and they say this is Torah or this is deoraisa, then you assume it's deoraisa, and if not, you assume it's derabbanan. Okay, that's the Rambam. The Ramban attacks him vehemently for this. In fact, here I got to read for the Ramban because it's just such a great zinger. Okay, the Ramban says, he quotes the Rambam's ruling. He says, "I'm aware that many other Talmudic passages contradict Rambam's words. For the content of the master's work is enjoyable and entirely delightful, with the exception of this rule, which uproots large mountains of Talmud and demolishes fortified walls of Gemara. For students of Talmud, this matter is evil and bitter. Let it drown and not be spoken." Okay, so the Ramban says the opposite rule. The Ramban's rule is anytime you see Chazal giving drashos on these psukim, you assume it's deoraisa unless they explicitly say that it's not. What do you know? Okay, that's a machlokes between the Rambam and the Ramban. Yeah. So it's funny. Both of them agree that there are these categories. Both of them agree that there are times when Chazal are doing A and times when Chazal are doing B, and they both agree, I think, that if you go against Chazal, then you are undermining the authority of Torah. But they disagree on which of the drashos to include in A and which to include in B.
I had a quick question. Is there are derabbanans only from the Yud Gimel Midos? They can only be made from the Yud Gimel Midos, or they could do it other ways? I guess like takanos and zeros are not, right?
Okay, correct. So so that brings us to our third category. Okay, and third category is halachos derabbanan, which are, I'm just going to review the categories, then I'll answer your question, Eliza. So gezeros, takanos, and minhagos, or minhagem. Okay, so loose definition of a gezerah is a rabbinic prohibition designed to protect a Torah violation or a Torah law. So we don't eat chicken and milk, midorabbanan, and that's to protect so that people don't get mixed up with meat and milk, which is d'oraisa. Or we prohibited certain actions that are not malacha because they might lead to doing malacha on Shabbos. So that's a gezerah. Takana is a positive rabbinic enactment, which the Rambam says is designed to strengthen the religion and to improve the world, or like I like to say, to amplify Torah themes. So, for example, all brachos are there to promote love of God and fear of God. The Rabbanan created all brachos except for Birkas Hamazon. We say Halal on holidays to acknowledge God's salvation and to praise him. We read the Megillah to commemorate the fact that God is near to us whenever we call him, etc. We light candles on Shabbos to provide kavod Shabbos and to enhance Oneg Shabbos. And then there's Minhagem, which I wanted to clarify this last time. The word minhag has multiple meanings. I said 3 meanings last time. There's officially sanctioned rabbinic, officially rabbinically ratified customs that started with the people, but then were made into halakha by the Sanhedrin. Okay. Meaning 2 is we use the term minhag to describe like other things that Jews do that have halakhic or hashkafic fulfillment in them. You know, like an example is like wearing white on Yom Kippur. That's a minhag. Chazal didn't legislate that. They didn't say you have to wear white on Yom Kippur, but it's something that like reminds us of the angels or like, you know, prompts us to do tshuva, you know, let's say singing Zmiros on Shabbos, right? Chazal never mandated that we sing Zmiros on Shabbos, but it's a minhag because it promotes learning at meals on Shabbos, you know, or enhances Shabbos enjoyment. And then the third meaning of minhag is we use minhag to describe how different communities paskin. When we say, for example, that, you know, the Ashkenazic minhag is to make 2 brachos on tefillin and Sephardim only make 1 bracha, we don't really mean minhag. We mean that Ashkenazim follow the Rosh, who holds that you make 2 brachos, and Sephardim follow the Rambam, who holds you make 1. So those are all 3 legitimate uses of the term minhag. But when the Rambam says minhag in this context, then he means specifically customs that arose from the people that were incorporated into the halakhic system by Chazal and like officially sanctioned, and have the same force of halacha as takanos and gezeros. Okay, so those are the 3 categories. Any questions on those 3 categories to clarify, and then I'll answer Elisa's question. Yeah, Brooke.
For the 2 days of Yom Tov, that's like, why is that a binding thing?
Yeah. So so I was actually talking about this with Isaiah after Shir last night, that Isaiah like was also shocked, just as I was, that keeping 2 days of Yom Tov was a minhag. So so he said like that sounds like something that would have been instituted by Chazal themselves, you know. And I don't know if this is a machlokes. The Rambam says it's a minhag. And again, minhag in this usage that Chazal officially sanctioned. So I gave him the analogy and I said, let's say like you were in a community in I don't know, in some like far off place in Alaska where there were no other Jews, and you like, you know, I don't know, like you weren't sure what day Pesach was. Okay, so what would you do? You would keep 2 days of Pesach out of safek, you know, out of doubt, right? Because it's such a severe prohibition. So apparently at the time when the calendar was determined by witnesses and the messengers wouldn't get out in time, apparently the people themselves took it upon themselves to keep 2 days of Yom Tov out of doubt. And then Chazal said, that's a very good practice. We're going to make it official. And then they officially sanctioned it, you know? So it stemmed from a Gezerah-esque concern of violating Torah laws, but apparently, according to the Rambam, it came from the people, and then it was officially like ratified by Chazal.
But why do we still do it?
We still do it because once it becomes halacha, then it is permanent. And that's the general rule. Once it's halacha, it's permanent. There is a complex system of overturning certain gezeros and minhagim that we're not going to go into. That like in certain cases, then you can, if a Sanhedrin arises later on that's greater than the first Sanhedrin in number and in chachma, and number here meaning the number of chachamim in Klal Yisrael who endorse it, so then they can overturn certain enactments made by prior Sanhedrins. But then certain other things, once the prohibition spreads, then we can't overturn it anymore. There is, you know, that's a whole topic, but yeah, and you are correct. I think your question is coming from the fact that now we know when the holidays are, you know, so why do we keep it? I think the reason why we keep it is because of that reason, that once it was accepted on Klal Yisrael, then we don't interfere with it because it involves prohibitions. That's my impression. I haven't been in the sugya in a while though. Okay, so
Can I
now,
ask a question real quick?
sure, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so all of this is, can you just give an example of what would be what would fall under the prohibition of adding to the Torah?
Okay, good. So I don't remember if I read this last time, but the Rambam actually raises that question himself. In case I did read it last time, I'm just going to paraphrase. So at the beginning of the Mishnah Torah, the Rambam lists all 613 mitzvos, and he says that all these were given to Moshe at Sinai. Okay, and then he says there were other mitzvos that were introduced after the giving of the Torah by the sages and the prophets. And he says, and we're obligated to keep these because of the psukim that we talked about. But then he asks the question that was just raised. What about the prohibition of don't add to the Torah and don't take away from it, right? How can the rabbis add to the Torah? And yeah, granted, the Torah gives them the authority to make new laws, but if the Torah also prohibits adding to the Torah and taking away from the Torah, how do you reconcile those? So the way the Rambam interprets it, and this is also a whole another topic. He says, Shelo yihi navi rashai l'chadesh davar, that no prophet is permitted to innovate something, vilomar, and to say shehakadosh baruch hu tzivahu b'mitzvah zo, and to say that God commanded it, lahosifa b'mitzvos lemitzvos Torah or lachasar achas me'elu hashosh esrei mitzvos hashesh me'os ushlosh esrei mitzvos. In other words, no prophet can make a law and then say that God commanded us in that law. He says, but if Beis Din, along with the prophet of the times, will add a mitzvah by way of takana or hora'ah or gezerah, this does not constitute an addition. And then he emphasizes again, for they did not say that HaKadosh Baruch Hu commanded us to make an eruv or to read the Megillah in its time. If they said this, they would be adding to the Torah. So according to the Rambam, the key, line that separates between legitimate rabbinic innovations and illegitimate augmentations of Torah is whether the rabbis say that it's d'Rabbanan or not. Okay, and if they were to not say it, then that would be adding to the Torah, according to the Rambam. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, good. Now going back to Elisa's question.
Can you repeat can you just repeat the category of the positive thing, not the Rabbanans that protect, but the positive ones? What is it?
So takana is the Rambam. I was just showing the Rambam earlier. The Rambam said that the takana is designed. Where does he say the phrase? So he uses two descriptions here. One is siag la Torah, as a safeguard for the Torah, ulefi ma shehashat tzricha, and based on what the times, the needs of the times. But then he uses this other phrase that says, in order to strengthen the religion and to perfect the world. So that, to my mind, means at least two things and maybe more. There are certain takanos that are designed to amplify Torah themes, like, again, saying brachos. Okay, there's a theme in Torah of love of God and fear of God. Okay, that we should be in awe of the Chachma in God's universe, and we should seek knowledge of God. And then there's another theme in Torah of blessing God on the food that we've eaten, that He's provided us, which is where we reflect on God's hashgacha, God's providence in the world. So Chazal took that theme and they said, okay, we want people to get into the habit of doing this as part of their lives. So they created all of the brachos that we say on thunder and lightning, and before we eat, and before we smell something, and before we do mitzvos. And they created these things to strengthen that Torah practice of like thanking God and recognizing God and loving God and fearing God all the time. So that's one example. Okay, that's amplifying a Torah theme. Or Megillah is another example, that God saved us and He's close to us and we want to commemorate that. Or another example is, we have a Torah mitzvah according to the Rambam to daven every day, but davening midoraisa was unstructured. As long as you praise God, ask for things, and then thank God once a day in whatever language you want, or whatever words you want to use, then you fulfill your Torah obligation. But then Chazal saw that people stopped being able to formulate these things accurately, so they created a structure for tefillah with the Shemona Esrei and with Minyan and with the whole setup there. There are other examples where they made a takana that was for purely practical reasons. So there's this practice of mayim achronim, which Jews, which is you wash your hands after a meal before you bench. And Chazal did that because there was this thing called melach Sodom, Sodom salt, which was this like dangerous substance that if you got it in your eyes, it could blind you. And I guess because this was like a safety hazard, Chazal said it's usher to, sorry, not it's usher. You have to wash your hands before you bench, you know? So that's not strengthening Torah themes, except maybe like you should guard your soul, but that's like actually protecting people from harm. Or let's say washing your hands before you eat bread. The Mishnah Brewer says that there are two reasons for that. One is that Kohanim, you know, in the time of the Mikdash had to wash their hands before eating truma, and I guess they would forget. And so Chazal made it a universal principle that everyone has to wash their hands so that the Kohanim will have to remember. And then even after the Beis Mikdash was destroyed, we still do it. They enacted it even when we do it to keep this practice alive, so that when the Beis Mikdash is restored, then people will already be in the habit. The second reason for washing our hands before eating is nikius, is cleanliness, you know, kedusha and nikius. And that's, you know, you could say that that's amplifying a Torah theme, or you could say that that's like, because eating with clean hands is more sanitary than eating with dirty hands, you know? So it's either like amplifying Torah themes or practical purposes, which I'm assuming the Rambam says means when he says based on what the times need, or to or tikkun ha'olam. This is not like Reform Judaism tikkun ha'olam. This is like you know like correcting problems in the world, you know.
So are they doing that under a specific mitzvah, or that was just like rabbinic, not just, but there's like rabbinic wisdom guidance or something
right,
like
so
that?
According to the Rambam, that is part of their charge of al pi Torah asher yerucha, the mitzvah saseh. And elsewhere the Rambam quotes the pasuk, did he quote it here? He says, oh no, he doesn't quote it here. Ushmartem mishmarti, which means make a safeguard for my safeguard, Hashem speaking, that that Chazal are charged with like making these fences around the Torah for either protective reasons or amplification reasons.
Can I ask, what status does a Sebula have in relation to like adding to the Torah?
Segulas are not even halakhically required, and might be problematic depending on how you relate to the segula. That, you know, we did this year earlier in the year about omen reading, you know, and like there are certain types of segulas that people do that they basically treat like good luck charms or bad luck charms that could be prohibited. But then if there is such a thing as a legitimate segula, then it's not even in the realm of halacha. The only problem would be is if you like treated it like halacha, like you have to do this, that might go into adding to the Torah territory. Not according to the Rambam, by the way. According to the Rambam, the only people who can violate the mitzvah of adding to the Torah, I think, is the Sanhedrin themselves. Like, I don't think he holds that an individual can like do something that like violates adding to the Torah. I think he holds that has to be like an enactment. Other Rishonim disagree. So yeah. Okay, going back to Eliza's question of Eliza, tell me if I got your question right. That are all Eliza asked, are all durabanans based on drashos, or can there be categories of durabanans that they don't base on drashos? Was that your question?
Yeah, that's
okay.
Yeah, that's
yeah.
correct.
So the answer is that they not all durabanans are attached to drashos. Some of them they do, and I don't know what determines which is which. Like I'm just trying to think of well-known examples. I'm blanking on them. I'm blanking on them. Well, okay, like I'll give you an example of this. Like the Rambam there's a mitzvah deoraisa of kibud av v'em, of honoring your mother and father. Okay, Rambam holds that midirabanan, you also have to honor your father's wife, even if she's not your mother, right? Like let's say like, you know, your father remarried, or this is like from, you know, or whatever. And then you also have to honor your mother's husband, okay, midirabanan. So and those are extensions of kibud av v'em. That part of honoring your father is honoring his wife, and part of honoring your mother is honoring her husband. So Chazal attached that to a drasha of the fact that the pasuk uses the extra word es. It says kabed es avicha ve'es imecha, and it attaches that derabanan to the word es. Okay, now why did Chazal make a drasha there? I don't know. There is an idea of chachmas hakasuv where whatever they could incorporate into to make it reflected in the text of the Torah B'Ksav, then they would try to make it reflected through these methods of drasha. So that might be why they did it. They might do it because in the eyes of the masses, then if people view it as attached to the word of God, it would give it more gravitas. Whereas if it's just like a rabbinic law that's like hanging in midair, then it would feel more like artificially imposed. They might be trying to draw attention to the philosophical ideas contained in it. It might be for mnemonic purposes. But I'm not under the impression that all D'Rabbanans were attached to drashos. In fact, I'm pretty sure that just like if you just like made a list of all the D'Rabbanans, I'm fairly confident that you would find. Actually, I don't know. I think you would find lots of them that are not attached to drashos, and I don't know which determine each policy.
And it would also be correct that takanos and gezeros are not.
Same thing with
or
those.
those.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, correct. That some of them are attached to psukim and some of them they did not attach to psukim. Okay. So that is the end of the first part of the review. Okay, and I'm glad we reviewed it because we get more out of it. In fact, I just saw this morning there's a statement of Chazal that says, I forgot the exact last one. Something like Eno dome misha shone pirko mea pamim lemisha shone pirko mea echad pamim. Says you can't compare someone who learns his chapter 100 times to someone who learns 101 times. Okay, meaning learning it, going over it is always good, but going over it one more time is better. And there's a chazal on that says you could learn this from donkey drivers, or let's just say Uber. I don't actually, no, Uber is not going to work out. He says you can learn from donkey drivers that if you hire a donkey driver, or whatever, donkey cart puller, I don't know what they called them back then. If you hire the donkey guy to take you 1 mile, he'll charge you, $10. But if you let's say, okay, back up. You ask the donkey guy to take you 10 miles, he'll charge you $10. But if you ask him to take you 11 miles, he'll charge you $20. Like there's a certain like cutoff point where like it'll double in price, So Chazal use that, and they say when you review your learning, you're not just getting all the stuff that you got from before, you're finding new points and new gaps in your knowledge that you didn't have before, and then clarifying them and then adding to that. So I think even though we just spent a half an hour on this, it was worthwhile, even though it's just review. Okay, so then we moved into the second part of the shir. Then we moved into the second part of the shir, which was the mysterious Mishnah with the cryptic midrash with the Ran. Okay, so I'm gonna just review this very briefly here. So the main thing that we're talking about here is this drasha on the pasuk in Shir Shirim. The pasuk says, "Kitovim dodecha miyain." Your love is better than wine. And there's a question of when it says your love, is it talking about God's love or Klal Yisrael's love? And the correct answer is God's love. The Gemara interprets that and says, "My kitovim dodecha miyain." What does it mean that your love is better than wine? Ki asa Rav Dimi Amar. Rav Dimi came and said, "Amra Knesset Yisrael lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu." The congregation of Israel said before God, "Ribono sha'olam, Master of the universe, arevim alai divrei dodecha yoser miyena shel Torah." Master of the universe, the words of your loved ones with a capital Y, and that's the rabbis, that's God's loved ones, are sweeter to me than the wine of Torah. Now, we said that if you just took that in isolation, you could say lots of different things. You could say it means that, Torah Shebal Peh is more enjoyable than Torah Shebechsav. You could say that the interpretations of Chazal are richer than the plain psukim. You could say a lot of stuff, but the Ran takes this as a statement about D'Rabbanans versus D'Oraisas, and he makes this astonishing claim. Venira maskanas haGemara to Rabbi Yochanan. It seems like this Gemara is in accordance with Rabbi Yochanan, which we didn't read. Sha'amar, who says, "Lo karas HaKadosh Baruch Hu bris im Yisrael ela bishvil dvarim shebal peh," that God only sealed a covenant with Israel because of Torah shebal peh. And how does the Ran interpret that? Ratz Lomar, and here's the main line: She'ikar hasachar hu b'mesh yichachu hachachamim. That the main reward for Torah is in what the chachamim innovated, what the rabbis innovated. Ubemesh yiskanu, and on that the takanos they made, their enactments, kedei laso siag l'Torah, that they made as a safeguard for Torah. So that's the astounding thing, that he's saying that the main reward for Torah is in the D'Rabbanans. Okay, and our question is, what? How so? How can that be? Okay, and he goes on. The Ran goes on and says that that's why Rabbi Yeshua said this thing to Rabbi Yishmael about the drush and shir shirim, that it has to do with because the whole dialogue was about why did the rabbis prohibit gavinos akum, the cheese made by non-Jews? And he didn't want to answer him. So instead he said, here's a drasha. And if you just read the Mishnah, it would seem like the drasha has nothing to do with the rabbinic prohibition against cheese from non-Jews. But according to the Ran, he told him that to show him that you might not know what the reason is for keeping this rabbinic law, but trust me, you get more reward for keeping the rabbinic law than the Torah law. Okay. And that takes us up to the end of last year. So that's our question here.
In the Gemara?
Say again?
Where was the original statement?
The original statement was in the Gemara. So the statement of the drasha on the pasuk in Shir Shirim of your love is better than wine is in the Mishnah, but then this statement here, the Jewish people said before God that the words of your loved ones are sweeter to me than the wine of Torah. That's in the Gemara. That's in the Avodah Zarah Daf Lamed Hey Amud Aleph. And then the Ran, who's a Rishon, interpreted it to mean that the essential reward for Torah is in the Rabbanans.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So now
just
our
like
question-
grammatically,
yeah, sure.
is that is he saying the reward is for keeping Darabbanans or the reward is Darabbanans, or is that not clear?
Okay, it's not clear. It's not clear from here. He will end up saying that it's for keeping Darabbanans. Okay. In contrast to others who interpreted that learning Darabbanans or like rabbinic interpretations are better, which again, if I just read this Gemara, how would I interpret it? So here's what I would say. I would say that, if you just had the psukim of the Torah without any interpretations, so then it's true that the main ideas are contained there, but they're inaccessible. The rabbis are the ones who bring out the sweetness of the Torah, and like I would have some idea that has to do with that. But the Ran goes, full on, no, it's keeping the Rabbanans gives you more reward than keeping the Raisas. Which, by the way, like, let's be honest here. It's okay. This is a midrash. Okay, midrashim are not meant to be taken literally. No one's gonna say that like literally you get more reward for keeping the Rabbanans than the Raisas. Like if you have to choose between like lighting a match on Shabbos versus like keeping the prohibition of muksa, don't start like striking matches. Okay, like obviously Doraisa is more important, but the question is, what idea is the Ran trying to bring out when he says from this Gemara that the Ikar reward, the essential reward, is from Darabbanans? Okay, so does anyone want to theorize on their own before we read the Ran's answers?
I have like a thought, but maybe not a full answer because I don't feel like it's fully approaching it.
Yeah.
I think that in terms of like accepting the yoke of Torah or something like that,
Yeah.
that Darabbanans are much harder.
Okay, yeah.
I don't know. Maybe
Definitely.
this is just my own experience, but like kind of like okay, like the stuff from God, I'm like okay with keeping, but then like I also have to do all these other things,
Okay, yeah. Okay, correct. And in fact, you know what? I'm going to interject. I know I just asked you guys a question, so hopefully, if you have an answer, you'll remember this. Okay. There's a thing which I don't know. It's possible that I've shown this to Nava in a class, but I don't think this was around tomorrow when I was teaching you. So there's this thing that I made to illustrate to my students just how much of our halachic practice is D'Rabbanan. Okay, so I call this the Map of Shabbos. Okay, hold on just 1 second here. Okay, so let me tell you a little backstory here, and it's going to seem like a tangent, but it's not, because I think it'll give us a concrete thing to work with here. Okay, so here's the story. Okay, my family's from Hawaii. Okay, and we used to visit, I guess before COVID, we used to visit Hawaii every summer to visit my grandma. All right, for those who don't know, there is a huge machlokas about where the halachic international date line is drawn. Okay, and it's a three-way machlokas, and by halachic international date line, if you know, like in non-halacha, there's an international date line where like one day becomes the next, and like that's just going to be based on the way that the earth is turning. You have to like make that judgment call at one point, which is why you can like take flights, from one location to another and arrive earlier than you took off, or like skip a day, like you travel through time, So there is a machlokas about where the date line is. Now, according to one of those opinions, then Hawaii falls out on one side of the date line, and according to the other opinion, it falls out on the other side. So there's a question of which day do you keep Shabbos on? Okay, so one opinion is from Friday night to Saturday night, the same way we do here, meaning it's on the same side of the date line that we are in the continental United States, or the mainland, as they say in Hawaii. On the other side of the machlokas says that it's on the other side of the date line, which means you have to keep Shabbos from Thursday night until Friday night. Okay, because Thursday night till Friday night really is the sixth day until the seventh day. All right, so this is big machlokas. So when I first went to Hawaii as an observant Jew, I asked my posek, like, what do I do for Shabbos? So he said, you have to keep full Shabbos from Friday night to Saturday night, but from Thursday night to Friday night, you have to be suffik de'oraisa l'chomra, suffik d'rabbanan l'kula, which means you have to be strict and keep all the Torah laws, and you don't have to worry about the rabbinic laws. Okay, so what that forced me to do is I had to like learn which is which. Now for Jews who have been keeping Shabbos for a while, like, you don't always know which one is which. So what I did was I learned them, and I made them into this chart to show my students, to show how much of their Shabbos experience is really deoraisa and how much is really derabbanan. So let's see how much you know about Shabbos. According to the Rambam, there are 4 mitzvos deoraisa that constitute Shabbos. 2 of them are mitzvos aseh, and 2 of them are mitzvos los aseh. Can anyone name any of them?
Lighting a fire.
Shamar and Zachor.
Okay, lighting a fire is part of one of them, but it's broader than lighting a fire.
It's not Shamor and Zachor?
Okay, so Shamor and Zachor, what do you mean by Shamor?
I don't know.
Okay, there you go, right? And what do you mean by Zachor?
I thought Shamor was like assays and no, the other way around. Shoot, I don't remember. I thought one was assays and one was lot assays.
Okay, which assays and lot assays? Because that's kind of what I'm asking. Yeah.
I know that Kiddush and Havdalah, like, we're supposed to make a separation. So Kiddush and Havdalah
Okay,
are
good.
assays.
Okay, so that's actually what the Torah means by Zachor. Okay, so Kiddush is one of the assays. Which one is, when Brooke said don't light a fire, what is that part of in Torah? In like, how's the Torah frame that?
Isn't that like from the Mishkan? Isn't
So that's where it's derived from, but Estie's right, is don't do malacha. Okay, so the one is Isser malacha, don't do creative activity on Shabbos, and there are 39 categories of that. One of them is lighting fires on Shabbos. Okay, then there's the aseh, which is what Estie was referring to, shamor, okay, which is to cease from doing work on Shabbos or to rest on Shabbos. For our purposes, then those are the same. Okay, meaning that there's certain halachos that the Torah reinforces by making it into a positive commandment and a negative commandment. Okay, then there's Kiddush, okay, which is you have to, like Vega said, you have to verbally acknowledge the praise, you have to acknowledge the merits, the virtue of the day in words. When Shabbos comes in, when Shabbos goes out, that's Kiddush. Okay, and anyone know the last los aseh? And by the way, I can't see if anyone raises their hands. So like either like just interrupt or like use the hand raise feature, because there's too many people in the share, so I can't see everyone at once.
is it working?
Working is going to be under the doing malacha or violating shvisa. The answer is tchum, is you can't travel outside of the city limits on Shabbos a certain amount of distance. Okay, and we don't really remember that one because we don't usually travel on Shabbos. Okay, so it's tchum. So this is Shabbos d'oraisa. Okay, now let me show you what Shabbos looks like. Okay, and I have here in the color code, for those who can see on the screen, green is Nevi'im, which is also D'Rabbanan, but I'm differentiating it because it's things that are mentioned in the actual Tanakh, but the halakhic institutions are D'Rabbanan, and then red is pure D'Rabbanan. Okay, so in addition to these things, you have Shavus. Now, Shavus is a category of rabbinic prohibition, which is designed to protect malacha, and there are 3 categories. Okay, Amir la'akum, which means it's usher to tell a non-Jew to do malacha for you on Shabbos. Okay, that's usher mid'Rabbanan. So on a Torah level, you can just dictate all the malachos you want. You could say, non-Jew, light this fire for me. And on a Torah level, that would be fine. But the Rabbanan prohibited it because they said if people are allowed to do that, they'll start to take malacha not seriously, and then they'll actually do malacha on Shabbos. Okay, another one is a whole category of Isurim d'Rabbanan, of things that lead you to malacha. Okay, so for example, do I put this as a separate category? Oh, sorry. Yeah. So like, there's certain things like it's usher to do certain things on wait, what would be an example of this? Like it's usher to use certain candles for your light, because these were candles with inefficient flames that people might adjust the flame and then ignite something on Shabbos. Okay. Or it's usher to, for some reason, everyone knows this one. It's usher to ride a horse on Shabbos because you might break off a branch. Okay. Because I guess that was the thing, people would break off branches, like, I don't know, prod the horse or something. And then there's other things that are usher to do that resemble malacha, you know, so you can't, even like certain warming things that you do on Shabbos that aren't technically cooking, you have to make a differentiation, and you can't put something directly on the heating surface because it looks like malacha, it looks like you're cooking. Okay, so all of those rabbinic prohibitions are part of Shavuos. Then there's muktzah. Muktzah is you can't handle certain objects on Shabbos, like manipulate them with your hands, either because they will lead to malacha, or they will be like they will detract from like the resting on Shabbos. So common examples: you can't handle a pen on Shabbos because you might come to write with it, or purposeless items like a stone or sticks you can't like handle on Shabbos because it's going to like interfere with the shvisa on Shabbos, however that is. Okay, then you've got kavod and onik Shabbos, which are principles that are Torah principles, but they only exist in thematic form, not in practical form. Okay, kavod Shabbos is honoring Shabbos before it enters, and then onik Shabbos is enjoying Shabbos. So the Rabbanan made laws to enact this. So you have Ner Shabbos, is lighting Shabbos candles. That's rabbinic, and that's so that you can provide light for your household, because it's an honor to Shabbos to have light, to have your house lit up. And also it provides onik Shabbos. There should be a line going to onik Shabbos because you enjoy your food more when you can see what you're eating. Okay. Then there's a requirement, midrabanan, to take a bath or a shower in hot water on Erev Shabbos because of kavod Shabbos. That back then people didn't bathe every day, but you should be freshly cleaned going into Shabbos. And that's actually midrabanan. Okay. Then there's preparing the house on Erev Shabbos, that the Rabbanan said that you should do actions that are involved in the preparation of Shabbos. And then famously, the Chazal would, this one Tana would cut vegetables. The other one would go like to market to buy the meat. The more you're involved in preparing for Shabbos, then the more you're fulfilling this rabbinic mitzvah, which is a strengthening of the theme of honoring Shabbos. Wearing Shabbos clothing when you go into Shabbos is a rabbinic requirement. Okay. You have to wear nicer clothing than you do, and if you can't afford nicer clothing, you should wear your regular clothing in a different way. Then there is onik Shabbos, okay, which is having 3 meals on Shabbos, okay. That is midrabanan, and that's to enhance your enjoyment. And included in that is you should have fancier food during Shabbos. Then there's if you're married, then having sexual relations on Shabbos night. If that's a possibility, nida aside or whatever, that's part of onik Shabbos. Okay, and then also part of kavod Shabbos is it's usher to have a big su'uda on Erev Shabbos, because that would overshadow your Shabbos meal, okay, or take away your appetite. Then you have this other category of asos chavetzecha, of doing other activities, and included in that is preparing for after Shabbos on Shabbos is usher, okay, because that diminishes the kavod of Shabbos. You aren't allowed to walk in certain ways on Shabbos. For example, a lot of people don't know this. You're not allowed to run or jump on Shabbos unless you're running for a mitzvah matter or unless you're doing it for enjoyment. Okay, so jumping rope, I guess, on Shabbos would be mutter. Running to shul would be mutter, but running, for exercise, just purely for exercise on Shabbos is asur midrabanan. Okay, and it's actually mentioned in the Nevi'im. Same thing with your speech on Shabbos. There's certain things you're not allowed to talk about, like talking about doing malacha or talking about your business. All right. One I forgot to put in here at all is doing business transactions on Shabbos. That's not a malacha, right? But it is it's prohibited. Other stuff is you're not allowed to start certain malachos on Erev Shabbos because they might carry into Shabbos. You're not allowed to do uvdin dechol, certain weekday-ish activities you're not allowed to do on Shabbos in order to preserve the specialness of Shabbos. You're not allowed to benefit from malacha that is done for you on Shabbos until after Shabbos. Back in the essays, Kiddush is deoraisa, but you know how you're yotze Kiddush deoraisa? By saying, hey, isn't it great at Shabbos? Okay, but the Rabbana came along and said you have to make a bracha, and you have to do it on a cup. And then for Havdalah, you have to have spices, and you have to have the Havdalah candle and all this other stuff, right? So if you look at this, Okay, and I experienced this for years in Hawaii, where I only kept the deoraisas. Oh, and there's lots of other stuff also. Sorry, this is not even a full chart. You know, midoraisa, you can't write with, let's say any malacha is only usher if done in a professional way, in the proper way. Let's say like writing with your right hand. But if you were to write with your left hand, that's not usher deoraisa, but the Rabbanan ushered it. Okay, or let's say like, you know, it's only usher deoraisa to carry from a private domain to a public domain. But if something is not a public domain, you know, it means that there's not enough people passing through it. So then midoraisa, you're allowed to carry into it, which means that, let's say like in Hawaii, when I'm in my hotel and like I'm on, you know, going from my hotel onto the beach, then I am allowed to carry, but because that's not a public domain deoraisa, but midorabanan, it's usher. So when I was in Hawaii, like what was Shabbos like experientially? It was bare bones. Like I could turn on any lights as long as it wasn't a light that would violate a doraisa, which meant that if it was an incandescent light where there was a metal filament, that's a doraisa violation. But if it was a fluorescent light, then that is not usher midoraisa. That's usher for some other reason, you know. Or let's say with cooking, you know, if I was cooking in an oven, you know, something, you know, then that would be usher midoraisa. But then other forms of cooking were not. And I could like, you know, carry stuff around with me, and like I could watch TV. And I didn't have to eat Shabbos meals. I didn't have to wear Shabbos clothes. I didn't have to like daven Shabbos davening. So this made me realize almost the entirety of Shabbos is midorabanan. Okay, like experientially, the entirety of it, you know, is midorabanan. So this, the whole reason I brought this up is if you go to what Tamar said, that the Rabbanan definitely make Torah, make halacha into a greater yoke. And you look at Shabbos, like I could basically have an almost normal weekday as long as I avoid incandescent lights and writing with my right hand, you know, in Hawaii on Thursdays, right? But it's the Rabbanan that fleshed out Shabbos in this entire like detailed way. And same thing for kashrus, and same thing for nida, and same thing for like all these other areas of halacha. You know, our whole davening and all our brachos. If Moshe Rabbeinu came in and you took him to shul, he'd be like, "What's going on?" Because Moshe Rabbeinu would not be familiar with brachos, with you know Kaddish, with Pesukah de Zimra, with you know Minyan, you know, all of these with a siddur, all of the with Shachris Mincha Mariv. Well, I guess maybe if you hold, you know, that the Avos introduced that, he wouldn't be familiar with all these things, okay, because all these are derabanan, you know. So almost the whole religion, you know, I mean that's an exaggeration, but like I've always wondered if you make a pie chart, what, you know, you have like a sliver that's you know it would be like a serving. But like a serving would be like of the pie would be deoraisa, and much more would be derabanan. Okay, so
Question.
Yes.
I don't know if we know this, but like, was Moshe doing other stuff that maybe wasn't, you know, mandated, but other types of things like this that weren't universal?
Highly likely, yeah. Like the theme of Oneg Shabbos and Kavod Shabbos, for example, existed in the time of Moshe, and you can bet that he made sure to have enjoyment on Shabbos, even though he wasn't obligated to have 3 meals. And you could be sure that he, well, we know he had Lechem Mishnah because he had the man, right? But even though there was no obligation of Lechem Mishnah, and I'm sure Moshe avoided, you know, talking about stuff that was not proper for Shabbos, and even beyond what we do, I'm sure Moshe Rabbeinu didn't talk about like, you know, non-chachma stuff on Shabbos, you know, even though that is beyond what even the rabbis mandated. So yeah, it just wasn't mandated at the time. Okay, so I hope this illustrates, again, I don't view this as a waste of time because I think it like depicts how much we really mean when we say derabanan. But now let's go back to our question here. Okay, hold on, make sure I got the right thing here. Okay, so back to our question. So can we develop Tamar's thing into an answer to this question of how can the essential reward be for derabanans? And Tamar's move was to say that it's the rabbinic laws that make Torah more into a yoke. And if you can't answer, that's fine, because we have the Ron's answers.
I always had this other idea that we have like the words that God gave us in the Torah, and that derabanan are their efforts to understand and interpret and derive words of God. And like that process, the intellectual process, is something that is very kadosh and unique. And I think that that effort to go through God's word, I think is like why people study Gemara, why like trying
Okay.
to connect that. So
Okay,
important.
good. All right, so I'm glad you said that, because that's not one of the Ron's answers, but it's an answer that I wanted to talk about anyway. So I'm going to call this the halakhic man answer. Okay, and I'm referencing the book by Rav Yosef Dov Halevi Soloveitchik, Halakhic Man, which if you haven't read, then at some point in your life you should read it. Advice that Rabbi Fox gave for reading it for the first time: read it straight through without stopping to think or without stopping to look up the complicated words, just to get the big picture, then go back and read it again with understanding. So one of the essential ideas in Halakhic Man is that someone who is involved in the study of halacha has a different view of the world, and it is a view. Okay, I'm a visual person, and I don't have aphantasia, so I can actually picture stuff in my mind. So I'll say this for people who also can picture stuff in their mind. It's like, in the movies when you see people using infrared technology, there's like a glow around certain things, that is picking up on the infrared light. So halakhic man, the way I see it, is like there's this grid of infrared like glow that is layered upon everything that we interact with in halacha, and that since halacha pertains to everything in life, then anything you encounter, you are thinking of in Torah categories, whether it's the philosophical implications of the Torah categories, or it's the halakhic implications. So let's say, for example, the ordinary person just drinks wine. Okay, and I'm using this example because I gave a shiur which was called The Universe of Torah in a Glass of Wine, and I expand upon this with the mitzvah of Kiddush and drinking wine. Let's say you could just drink wine, right? But think about how many halachic and hashkafic ideas are layered upon that. So you have, saying a bracha on the wine and reflecting on the fact that God created the fruits of the vine and gave man the ability to apply his knowledge of science to harness fermentation to make this beverage that has all of these like psychological and neurological effects and societal roles. So that's, you reflect on that in making the bracha on wine. And then you have like, yayin nesech, that it's usher to eat wine, to drink wine that is used in avodah zarah rituals. And then stam yenam, that if a non-Jew touches a wine, then midrabanan it becomes usher. And then you have like, the idea of which bracha is made on wine. Like, is it ha'etz because they're from the tree, or is it hagafen because it deserves its own special bracha? And then you have truma and meiser and like all the agricultural halachos. And then you have, wine on Shabbos. So anytime a person who's immersed in Torah looks at wine, there's this like added layer of intellectual involvement that extends to their own personal perfection in the way that they live and the way they view the world. And same thing when you see, another person, or you see a piece of furniture, or you see like an animal, everything that you see has all these halakha categories layered onto it. Now, how does this connect to here? So I think what Fega was suggesting is, by implication, is if you just had the oraisas, then there would be a certain amount of concepts that you would associate to your real world interactions. But what the Rabbanan do is they cover everything. Everything has halachos that interact with it and that connect you to the D'oraisa themes. So when you're walking around, like a friend of mine who was a Ben Noach, who is a non-Jew who kept, the Sheva Mitzvahs Ben Noach, Sean. So the way he described it is he said, I'm envious of you Jews, because he said, it's like you guys are walking around in a museum with all of these fascinating exhibits that are there for you to learn from, but the museum is real life. Like every single object you interact with and every single event that happens in any activity you do is imbued with halakhic significance. And the more you're involved in halacha, the more you will appreciate that. Again, whether it's on an intellectual level or an ethical level or a philosophical level, you're going to be interacting with Torah concepts no matter where you turn. And it's because of the D'Rabbanans quantitatively that you're able to do this and to connect it to the essential Torah ideas. So I don't know how much I was expressing what you were saying, Fega, or how much I was Maya, or how much I was co-opting it and like saying my own idea. Is that what you had in mind, or you had some other thing in mind?
Yeah, that was pretty much a good summary.
Okay, good. So that's a great answer. Okay. Anyone else have an answer? Okay, so let's go into the Ron's answers. So he starts off with something which is going to require a little bit more facts. Okay, so we're going to read what he says first, and then we're going to have a question and then go into the facts. So he says like this.
I have one
Yes.
question, or
Sure.
maybe no answer, just based on what you were saying before about how Cholesterol was very concerned about having the 2-day, not to mess up on the 2-day Yontif.
Right.
But there's a different
Ah.
expression of attachment in doing the Darbanans, not just in
Okay.
what we get out of it, but what we're doing when we do them.
Okay, that's really good answer. So debatable whether that is going to fit into what the Ron says, but it's a good answer nonetheless. So let's talk about it here. So what Esti's saying is that since all the D'Rabbanans are there to either protect or to amplify Torah themes, then when you keep D'Rabbanans, you are really expressing your valuing of the Torah's of the Torah. So for whatever reasons you are keeping Torah law, whether that is for the perfection you gain from it, or whether it's just because God commanded it, or whether it's because, like, for Olam Haba, whatever your reasons are for keeping Torah laws, the D'Rabbanans are additional opportunities for involving yourself in those Torah foundations and expressing that. And I can show this in two real world examples. Like, let's say, for instance, you are okay, I'll use I hope this doesn't trigger anybody. Let's talk about safety precautions with at the beginning of the pandemic, okay, when we didn't know what we were doing. All right, so like everyone had a genuine concern that we didn't want to get the coronavirus and we didn't want other people to get sick, okay? But what we did was we basically, like, or at least those of us who were responsible, we took many precautions that were added, so to speak, but they were connected to that to that primary concern. So like this was bad, wearing masks, definitely, social distancing, not like we were Lysoling stuff, so eventually we found out which ones, or we're still finding out which ones are necessary and which ones are not. But for the los ases, then we were, if you care about something that is a real concern, you take additional concerns to reinforce that value. So whatever reasons you were trying to avoid the bad thing, the additional fences are further involvement in strengthening those values of avoiding the bad thing. Okay, on the other side, you could use an analogy of, let's say you are, I don't know, throwing a birthday party for somebody. So you essentially want to create a celebration that makes them happy. But if you were to do a bunch of extra stuff that was taking care of the details, or like going that extra length to make sure that, like, I don't know, it's their, the decorations are their favorite color, or like the cake is their favorite type of cake, or you play the type of music that they have. So it is expressing it's an opportunity to express greater devotion to the positive concept that's at the core, Or if you want to use another example, and this is based on my westernized stereotyping of Japanese rituals, okay, which I have never actually studied this, but Japanese people historically have ritualized many things. So let's say like the tea ceremony, like having very rigid, precise ways of making tea, of like, you do this exact motion and then you steep it for this long and then you fold the towel in this way and all this other stuff. So is it because that's how you make good tea? No, like some of it might have to do with how you make good tea, but a lot of it is like highly ritualized. So why do that? Because what they're trying to do is that they value tea and the drinking of tea as a primary value, but by endowing it with these additional requirements that surround it, it strengthens their relationship to the primary activity. If you just go and you just like boil water and steep a tea bag, so then that doesn't allow you to appreciate or to be involved in the tea to the extent where if you ritualize it and make it into something that is more than just like a practical, like a bare minimum making of tea. So a lot of the D'Rabbanans, by formalizing all the aspects of how you engage in the D'Oraisa, bring out and enhance the specialness of the D'Oraisa and all, and strengthen the reasons why you do keep the D'Oraisa, or prompt you to look into the D'Oraisa to like keep it more. Like again, take my Shabbos example. If we just kept Shabbos on a D'Oraisa level, let's say we didn't have meals on Shabbos. Let's say you didn't have to eat meals on Shabbos. How many people would actually relate to Shabbos as a day of enjoyment? Like, would you really like, but no, we dress up and we eat 3 meals on Shabbos with fancy food, getting together with people. And what that does is it helps us to recognize that Shabbos is a day of enjoyment, and we wouldn't do that on our own, or Kavod Shabbos, we wouldn't recognize that Shabbos is a day worthy of honoring if it was just a day of restrictions. So like that's what the Durabanas do. Again, Esty, I don't know if I was expressing what you were saying or like co-opting it or a little bit of both. If I miss anything, then feel free to fill in the blank.
Oh, good.
Okay, good. Okay, so let's do one thing. Okay, let's read the Ron's answer, which might overlap with Esty's answer, and then we'll leave off on a question. Okay, so he says like this. The Ron says as follows: the Zoha Memra. This statement in the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, Yischaber Pirusha al derech shekasavnu, is clarified according to what we have written. Okay, namely, actually, you know what? I forgot. The Hebrew here is from a bad edition of the Ron, and the English is from a good edition. So I'm just going to read the English. He says that since once the sages agree to enact a certain decree, it is immediately as if it were told to Moshe by the Almighty. By rights, it is fitting for Israel to receive greater reward for that which they accepted upon themselves willingly, i.e., by enacting rabbinic decrees, than the reward that they should receive for that which Hashem exalted as he commands them and which they must perform against their will. Now, let me just translate that into English. Okay, he's saying like this. According to the Ron, okay, and the Rambam, once the Rabbanan create a law, then it has the force of a Doraisa. Okay, the difference though is that the Doraisa was required by Hashem, whereas the Rabbanans were created by human beings. So what he's saying is, since we accepted the Rabbanans upon ourselves voluntarily, then we should get more reward for doing something that we accepted upon ourselves voluntarily than something that we were forced to do. Now, does anyone have any questions or problems with that?
Yes,
There
I
are
think that,
two major ones.
Men and women, that women at if you're not commanded, it's less than if you are commanded, because then you're doing Zvar Hashem.
Okay, good. So problem number one is, don't we hold the opposite? Okay, and the opposite is Gadol mitzvah v'oseh mimi she'eino mitzvah v'oseh, that greater is a person who is commanded and does the mitzvah than a person who's not commanded and does the mitzvah, meaning doing it voluntarily. Okay, that question is the question that the Ron takes up. He says, do not challenge me based on what Chazal mentioned in many places. Gadol mitzvah v'oseh mimi she'eino mitzvah v'oseh. Right? He says, Esti, don't ask that question. Okay, and Chazal say in Kiddush 31a regarding Dama ben Nesina, okay, who was a non-Jew who honored his father in an extraordinary fashion. There's this case of Dama ben Nesina where Chazal are saying, like, how far do we have to go for kibbut av aim? And so I don't remember the exact details, but the case is this guy Dama ben Nesina was a non-Jew, and Chazal came up to him and said, like, hey, could you sell us some of your merchandise? And he said, sure. And and the key was, I think, like under the pillow of his father who was sleeping, and he didn't want to wake up his father. And Chazal said, like, we'll give you tons of money. And he's like, nope, like I don't want to disturb my father. So Chazal said, when they saw this, they said, now, if one who does a mitzvah without having been commanded receives such a reward, because Jews are not obligated in kibbut av aim, then one who does a mitzvah having been commanded, how much more so? Okay, so the Ron agrees with the question, okay, that in Judaism, we say that if you're obligated to do something, you get more reward than someone who's not obligated. Okay, so the Ron answers that by saying, regarding this, I have three arguments, which will be next time. Okay, he gives three arguments against it. So, but that is a good question, SD, that we generally hold the opposite in Judaism, that if you're people who keep something because they have to is more reward than people who keep something because they take it upon themselves voluntarily. Okay, so that's one question. We're going to table that for next time.
Okay, can I just ask one question on that also?
Sure.
Is there a distinction between taking on something that you're not commanded at all versus something that's an extension of what you're commanded?
I have not seen such a distinction. And it seems like the Ron is working with the premise that there is no such distinction.
Okay.
Yeah, there might be. I haven't seen it and he hasn't said it.
Can I ask a different question?
Yes.
Don't we have to keep Durabanans? Like,
Okay, good. That's the other
Yeah.
question, right? So the other question is, what do you mean that we accept the Rabbanan on ourselves voluntarily? The Ron just got through saying that once the Rabbanan enact something, we have to keep it mida oraisa because of al pia Torah asher yerucha and lo sasar mikol davar asher yagidu lecha yamin u'shmol, right? So like, you can't have it both ways, Ron. Like, either you characterize the Rabbanans as something that you have to keep, in which case it's equal to the oraisas, or you say it's voluntary, in which case your whole theory about Durabanans is out the window. So what does it mean that you have to keep it? What does it mean that, how can he characterize Durabanans as voluntary, that we accepted it upon ourselves willingly when it's not actually voluntary? And that's the question I want to answer today as the last question of this year for today.
Well, some of them were, right? I mean, some did come around about that way. I guess that's actually mostly Minhagem. Never mind.
Yeah, that's Minhagem, right. And then what Tamar's saying is true, that even with the Minhagem, once they make it into a Durabanan, then you have to keep it. Okay, so the answer to this may shock you if you've never heard this before, and it shocks me even though I have heard it before, because it opens up a whole can of worms. Okay, so I'm just going to show you the can of worms like that, and then they're going to all wriggle off screen, and we're going to forget about them because I haven't researched this. Okay, but I'm going to show you the fact. The fact is that it really was accepted willingly. Okay, how so? So if you look at the Rambam in Hilchos Mamrim, when he's talking about the process of Beis Din making Durabanans, he says like this: Beis Din shenir lahem ligzor gezerah, a Beis Din that sees fit to make a decree, o l'sakin takana, or to make an enactment, o l'hanhig minhag, or to ratify a custom, tzrichen liyahis yashiv b'davar. They need to deliberate on the matter, meaning they need to take their time to think about it. V'leda tchila, and they need to know from the outset, im rov hatzibur yecholin la'amod ba, if the majority of the community is able to stand by it. Oh, ein rov hatzibur yecholin la'amod ba, or if b'davar zeh, or if the majority of the community cannot stand by it. U'la'olam ein gozrin gezerah al hatzibur ela im kein rov hatzibur yecholin la'amod ba, and they can never make a decree or a takana or a minhag that the majority of the community cannot stand by. So this is the rule at the outset. So the Chazal don't have unchecked power. Okay, it's somewhat of a system of checks and balances, that Chazal cannot make a law unless they assess that the majority of Klal Yisrael can keep it. Okay, so that's from the outset. So in that sense, it's willing. Okay, but you might say, that's not really willing. Well, check this out. Okay, and this is the worms, the can of worms. Hare shegazu Beis Din gezerah. If Beis Din make a decree, the dimu sherov hatzibur yicholin lamava, and they think that the majority of the people can abide by it, the achar shegazru osa, and after they make the decree, pikpaku ha'amba, then people raise doubts about it, velo pashta barov hatzibur, and it does not spread through the entire community, hare zo batela, then that decree is automatically nullified. And they can no longer compel people to follow it. Okay, so an example of this is that there used to be a halachic requirement that if a man has a seminal emission, then he has to go in a mikvah before he can say words of Torah or brachos or tefillah or something like that. Okay, I don't remember the exact parameters. Okay, and that decree was actually implemented, and they thought that people could stand by it, and then they realized that ended up not spreading throughout all of Klal Yisrael, so it was nullified automatically, and Chazal did not have the ability to enforce it. Okay, now the can of worms part is as follows. On the one hand, a derabanan can only stick if the community of Israel accepts it upon themselves. Okay, and if they don't accept it upon themselves, and that's determined by the majority, if they don't accept it upon themselves, then Chazal have absolutely no power to enforce it. Okay, and it is automatically nullified. But the weird thing is like this: is let's say we had a Sanhedrin today, and they made a law. They assessed that the majority of people could follow it, and they made a law. So here's the thing: we are obligated to follow it. Now, if the majority of Jews violate the derabanan, and eventually it becomes apparent that the majority of Jews can't follow it, then it falls away. But in the meantime, we were actually violating Torah laws. So it's a weird, like intermediate state where they have the ability to make a law as soon as they assess that the majority of people can keep it. And once they make the law, it is binding and you're forced to do it. And if you violate, you're violating not only the rabbinic law, but the two deoraisas of Al Pia Torah and Lo Sasum Mikol Davar Sheyigidu L'Chal Yamin U'Shmol. But if the majority of the people continually violate it and it doesn't spread, so then it is nullified. And that's just weird to me, but that is, so now we can see what the Ran means when he says that Klal Yisrael accepts it upon themselves willingly, which he means that literally, that yes, it is biblically mandated by those two mitzvos that we have to obey based in, but ultimately at the end of the day, it's dependent on whether Klal Yisrael accepts it upon themselves or not. So on an individual level, it's not voluntary, but on a communal level, it is voluntary.
We have a question.
Yeah, Maya?
What point in time, like if the Kehillah like says like, oh, we don't accept this upon themselves, or they have a doubt about what the Beit Din just decreed, does it have to
Right.
be at the time decreed, or is there
So
a time frame?
that's one of the questions that I have not found an answer to yet. That what are, like, how long is this trial period? You know, like let's use a crazy example, and I'm using the crazy example because like I don't think that anyone would actually say this. Most Jews are not religious today. Right? So does that mean that like all the D'Rabbanans are no longer obligatory? No, I've never heard anyone say that, you know? So clearly we're not taking into account just like factually like a statistical analysis of Klal Yisrael. Well, maybe you'll say among the observant community. Well, guess what? I've also never heard anyone say that if there is a rabbinic law that most people don't keep, then it just falls away. You know, like there's lots of rabbinic laws I can think of that most people don't keep. Like, I mean, okay, I don't know if this is an example, but like I experientially, this is an example. You know, it's usher to walk in front of someone when they're davening Shemona Esrei. Okay, I've been to shul. I haven't been to a ton of shuls, but lots of shuls. It seems like people just don't keep this halacha. Does that mean that it falls away? I don't think so. Like I've just never heard that before. You know, let's say like you know, Shnayim Mikra v'Echad Targum. Every Jewish male is obligated every week to read the entire parsha twice and in Hebrew and once in Aramaic. Okay, I don't know the statistics, but I do know a lot of people in the modern Orthodox world who aren't very makpid on this halacha. You know, does that mean it just falls away? No. So the question is like why not, and what are the parameters? Like, does this rule only apply when we still have a Sanhedrin? You know, and now that we don't have a Sanhedrin, then everything is frozen in time. You know, was there an actual like expiration date where like you try it out for like a certain number of years and then it becomes halal? You know, I don't know the how do Chazal measure the majority of people? Like clearly they didn't take surveys, you know. So all of these are good, valid questions that I just don't have the answer to.
Another question on the Ran is that he says that the people accepted it upon themselves, but according to this Ran, not that the people accepted it, it's that they just didn't reject it. Yeah.
So that's the one awkward thing that you have to say, that the acceptance means that they did not reject it, you know, and you know, that's the only, there are two roads you can take in interpreting this Ran. Okay. There's taking him literally, and then there's taking him like not literally. Okay. This is the most literal way I can take the Ran, that literally Klal Yisrael has to accept the D'Rabbanans for them to be binding, and the only like little move I have to make is acceptance means not rejecting. You could take him like figuratively, saying like Klal Yisrael as a whole didn't have to make these D'Rabbanans, but the Chachamim made the D'Rabbanans, and in that sense, it's emerging from the willingness of the community of Israel. The only problem with that is, to me, that makes it seem like, yeah, that Sanhedrin made it willingly, but what about all the other people? You know, it doesn't seem to me like intellectually honest to say that Klal Yisrael is like accepting it willingly, whereas according to my interpretation, you know, based on that Rambam, then it is literally all of Klal Yisrael is accepting it. Yeah. Footnote, by the way, there is one case of this that undoubtedly would be true, and this when I realized this made me feel really good. That there is one case that you can have a person who willingly, on an individual level, accepts upon themselves to keep God's laws and therefore deserves greater reward. Anyone know what I'm alluding to? Converting to Judaism, right? So when you convert to Judaism, then you have a person who is not commanded, and he accepts upon himself or herself the entire corpus of Torah and rabbinic law without the ability to go back, you know, and that is saying that deserves a greater reward than someone who's forced to do it. Now, the reason why I said this might overlap with what Esti was saying is because why should this, you know, he says that by rights it is fitting for Israel to receive greater reward for a voluntary thing. I think that might be because of what Esti said, which is that the fact that Klal Yisrael does accept these things, these D'Rabbanans, does show how much they value the Doraisas. You know, either that they don't want to violate the Doraisas or that they care about the themes. or like Maya said, that they want more involvement in the halakhic system so that they can get more benefit out of the halakhic system, but through like halakhic man, like infrared lenses, you know. And I think those are not the only two answers. I think you can get like lots of lots of answers for why doing something voluntarily, like, you know, whenever, if you see someone like, look, if you see someone volunteering at a soup kitchen, right, it's intuitive, it's an intuitive thing, like, oh, that person is on a higher level than someone who is like forced to work there. You know, the fact that they do it voluntarily shows that they value these things greater. So like, you know, doing something voluntarily that you take upon yourself definitely shows like a greater valuing, more alignment with the Torah's values than doing it by force. Okay, so I think this is a good stopping point, unless anyone has questions. And I just want to like reiterate what question we're going to work on for next time. The question we work on for next time is Esti's question, which is, don't we hold the opposite? Chazal say in many places that doing something because you're commanded and obligated to is greater than doing something that you're forced to. It's greater than doing something voluntarily. So that would seem to undermine the Ran's whole answer. And the Ran is going to give us three answers for why that is not the case. Okay, so stay tuned. But I'll stay on if anyone has any questions on any of this.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good Shabbos and good Chodesh, everyone. Bye.
Shabbos, good Chodesh.